Yeah, I have presided over thousands of cases in my years on the bench. Petty thieves, high-profile fraudsters, emotional victims, and courtroom moments that tested the very limits of the law. But this case involving a notorious crime boss trying to intimidate me in my own courtroom, is something that still sends a cold shiver down my spine when the gavel echoes in my memory. Because what happened that day wasn't just a standard criminal trial. It was a direct collision between organized underworld power and the unyielding pillar of justice. And I was the one sitting at the apex of it all. I still remember the morning with crystal clarity. The courtroom was suffocatingly packed long before the heavy wooden doors officially opened. Reporters were crammed into the back rows, their notebooks poised. Cameras were strictly prohibited, but that never stops the heavy electric tension from vibrating through the room when a name like Victor Thorne is on the docket. He wasn't just a street criminal, he was an architect of fear, a man who had orchestrated a massive empire of illicit operations and had never once faced the inside of a prison cell, until he walked into my courtroom. When I took my seat on the bench, I noticed something immediately. He wasn't nervous. That alone caught my attention. In my decades of experience, defendants who walk in facing decades behind bars usually show a crack in their armor. They fall into predictable categories. They sweat, they fidget, or they overcompensate with loud, hollow bravado. Victor Thorne did none of that. He belonged to a different breed entirely. He sat at the defense table with the posture of a ruthless CEO attending a minor, slightly annoying board meeting. His suit was immaculate, dark, and tailored to perfection. He leaned back in his leather chair, his hands resting calmly, almost lazily, on the table. And then there was the key witness seated across the aisle, a former associate turned state informant, David Miller. David kept his eyes glued to the floor. His breathing was shallow and erratic, his knuckles stark white as he clutched a folder of testimonies. I remember looking down from the bench and thinking he looked like a man who knew he was already a ghost. He carried the weight of a man who believed the law couldn't protect him from the man sitting just 10 feet away. The prosecutor stood and began outlining the heavy charges: racketeering, severe extortion, and witness tampering. But what struck me wasn't the weight of the legal language or the severity of the crimes. It was the absolute chilling silence from Thorne's side of the room. No dramatic objections, no panicked, whispered consultations with his high-priced defense team. Just a cold, calculating stillness. Because in my years as a judge, I've learned one psychological truth. People who feel trapped react, even if it's with anger or denial. But people who believe they are truly untouchable, they stay still. They just watch. As the prosecutor read the charges, Thorne slowly shifted his gaze from the trembling witness, bypassing the jury entirely, and locked his eyes directly onto mine. He wasn't looking at a judge. He was sizing up an obstacle. The evidence against Thorne was staggering. The prosecution had spent 3 years building this case. They had wiretaps, financial records routed through shell companies, and sworn affidavits. But all of that paper meant nothing without the man on the stand. David Miller was the linchpin. He knew the inner workings of Thorne's empire because he had helped build it. He knew where the bodies were buried, both figuratively and literally. When the prosecutor finally finished his opening statement, he asked Miller to recount a specific meeting that took place in a warehouse on the south side of the city, a meeting where a local business owner had been brutalized for refusing to pay protection money. Miller opened his mouth to speak. He looked terrified, but he also looked resolved. He was ready to testify. And that is exactly when it happened. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't an explosive outburst. It was something far more insidious. As Miller drew a breath to begin his testimony, Thorne leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He didn't look at his lawyer. He didn't look at me. He stared directly at Miller. And in a voice so low it barely registered above the hum of the courtroom's air conditioning, but so sharp it cut through the silence like a razor blade, Thorne spoke. "How's Sarah doing in Boston, David?" The courtroom froze. The prosecutor stopped mid-step. The defense attorney closed his eyes briefly, knowing exactly what line had just been crossed. I sat up straight on the bench, my blood running cold. Sarah. I didn't need a case file to know who that was. The context provided the answer instantly. It was Miller's daughter. A daughter who had been hidden away, placed in a separate protective custody program, a detail that was supposed to be completely sealed from the defense. Thorne hadn't yelled a threat. He hadn't said, "I'll kill you if you speak." He didn't need to. In the criminal underworld, explicit threats are for amateurs. True power speaks in implications. By simply uttering her name and her location, Thorne was delivering a message with terrifying clarity. You think the government can protect you? They can't even hide your family from me. Speak, and she pays the price. The psychological impact on the witness stand was immediate and devastating. Miller physically shrank. All the resolve he had mustered moments before vanished. He looked at Thorne, his eyes wide with a primal, suffocating fear. The color drained from his face, and he began to shake uncontrollably. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The threat had landed perfectly. Objection, Your Honor, the prosecutor bellowed, finally breaking the stunned silence, his voice trembling with genuine outrage. The defendant is actively intimidating the witness in open court. I didn't immediately sustain the objection. I didn't strike the gavel right away, because in that split second, I realized I was facing a critical juncture, not just for this trial, but for the integrity of the judicial system itself. Thorne was testing me. He was broadcasting his power, proving to everyone in that room that his reach extended past the iron bars of a jail cell, past the armed bailiffs, and straight up to my bench. He wanted to show that he, not the law, controlled the outcome of this room. I looked at Thorne. He had leaned back in his chair again. The faint trace of a smile played on his lips. It was the smirk of a man who believed he had already won. He was waiting to see what the system would do. He expected the usual routine: a stern warning from the judge, a minor contempt charge, a short recess to calm the witness down, followed by the witness ultimately refusing to testify, claiming memory loss out of sheer terror. He expected me to play by the standard rules, but he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had brought his street rules into my house, and I have never, in my entire career, allowed anyone to make a mockery of my courtroom. The silence in the room wasn't just heavy, it was toxic. I looked at the defense attorney, who was already half out of his seat, preparing the standard barrage of procedural apologies. Your Honor, my client was merely making an offhand remark, entirely taken out of context, he started, his voice completely lacking its usual theatrical confidence. I didn't let him finish. I raised my hand, just an inch. It is a subtle gesture I've perfected over 4 decades on the bench, and it carries more weight than the wooden gavel ever could. The attorney snapped his mouth shut instantly and slowly lowered himself back into his leather chair. Mr. Thorne, I said, my voice deliberately measured, stripped of any anger, panic, or emotion. You seem to be operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of your current geography. You are not in a back alley. You are not in a heavily guarded boardroom. You are in my courtroom. And in here, your street currency holds absolute zero value. Thorne's arrogant smirk faltered, just for a microscopic fraction of a second. It was the micro-expression of a predator realizing the terrain was entirely unfamiliar. He wasn't used to being spoken to like a child who had misbehaved. He was accustomed to fear, immediate compliance, and backroom negotiation. I gave him absolutely none of those. Bailiff, I commanded, not taking my eyes off Thorne for a single second, remove the jury from the room. As the jury was hastily ushered out, stealing nervous, wide-eyed glances at the defense table, the entire structural atmosphere of the room shifted. Without the audience of his peers to intimidate, Thorne's theatrical power play lost its primary stage. He was left entirely alone with the cold architecture of the justice system. Once the heavy oak door clicked shut behind the final juror, I turned my absolute attention back to the witness stand. David Miller was still shaking, a broken man desperately clutching the shattered remnants of his courage. He had resigned himself to a horrific fate. Mr. Miller, I said, softening my tone just enough to pierce through his blinding panic, but keeping it firm enough to serve as an anchor. Look at me. Look only at me. He slowly lifted his gaze. His eyes were wide and terrified, instinctively darting toward the defense table before snapping back to the high bench. You are under the absolute, unwavering protection of this court, I stated clearly, ensuring every single syllable reverberated off the wood-paneled walls. The individual sitting across from you has just attempted to manipulate these legal proceedings using cheap fear. It is a desperate tactic as old as crime itself, and it is a tactic that fails the exact moment you simply refuse to be afraid. Do you understand me? Miller swallowed hard. The silence stretched. Finally, he gave a weak, almost imperceptible nod. But I knew hollow words from a judge weren't enough. Thorne had invoked a very real, physical threat, his daughter. I needed to respond with an immediate, physical demonstration of severe consequences. I needed to show Victor Thorne that his untouchable aura permanently stopped at the swinging double doors of my courtroom. Bailiff, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room, step forward. The bailiff, a seasoned officer who had seen his fair share of courtroom drama, immediately moved from his post near the door and positioned himself directly behind Thorne's chair. He didn't draw a weapon, but the physical proximity of a badge and a uniform changed the dynamic of the space instantly. Now, I continued, leaning slightly over the bench to ensure my focus was locked solely on Thorne. Mr. Miller, you are going to answer the prosecutor's question. And you, Mr. Thorne, are going to listen. If you so much as exhale too loudly, if you attempt to catch his eye, or if you utter a single syllable that isn't directed specifically to your counsel, you will find yourself in a holding cell so fast it will make your expensive suit spin. I paused, letting the reality of the situation settle into the very foundation of the room. Thorne's eyes narrowed. He was calculating the odds, weighing his constructed persona against the cold, hard authority of a judge who refused to play his game. He had built his empire on the belief that everyone had a price, a breaking point, or a threshold of fear. "Do we understand each other, Mr. Thorne?" I asked. It wasn't a request for a polite confirmation. It was a demand for total submission to the court's authority. Thorne looked at the bailiff standing behind him, then back at me. He gave a sharp, incredibly brief nod. It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement of gravity. He realized, perhaps for the first time in his life, that the power he wielded on the streets evaporated the moment he stepped onto my floor. "Good," I said smoothly, before turning my attention back to the witness stand. "Mr. Miller, the court recognizes the immense pressure you are under, but I assure you, the state's reach is longer than his. Now, please, recount the events of the meeting." The transformation in David Miller was slow but undeniable. The initial shock of Thorne's thinly veiled threat had paralyzed him, but the court's immediate, uncompromising response had acted as a lifeline. He took a deep, shuddering breath, gripping the edges of the witness stand as if it were the only solid object in a world falling apart. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, but it was steady. He began to outline the intricate details of Thorne's extortion racket. He named names, he confirmed dates, and he connected the financial dots that the prosecution had spent years trying to map. Every word he spoke was another brick removed from the fortress Thorne had built around himself. And as Miller testified, I watched Thorne. The arrogant smirk was completely gone. The relaxed posture had tightened into rigid, suppressed fury. He was forced to sit in agonizing silence, listening to his own empire being dismantled piece by piece by a man he thought he had successfully terrified into submission. He had tried to use fear to bend the courtroom to his will. Instead, he had inadvertently demonstrated to the jury and to himself exactly why he needed to be locked away. The illusion of his invincibility had been shattered, not by a dramatic legal loophole, but by the simple, unwavering application of judicial authority. I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I leaned slightly forward, placing both hands flat on the polished wood of the bench, and I made sure my next words were not just heard, but felt. "Mr. Thorne, this courtroom is not a negotiation table. It is not a street corner. It is a fundamental instrument of the United States justice system. And as of this exact second, you have crossed a line that leads directly to consequences you cannot buy your way out of." I watched his jaw clench. The muscles fluttered beneath the skin of his cheek. He was a man who had built an entire criminal enterprise on the foundation of intimidation. He expected people to cower when he spoke. He expected witnesses to forget their own names. He expected judges to be cautious, maybe even a little afraid of the phantom power he represented outside these walls. But inside these walls, I am the ultimate authority, and I needed to make that violently clear. "I am officially finding you in direct criminal contempt of this court," I stated, the words striking the silent room like physical blows, "for your blatant, calculated attempt to intimidate a state witness. You are hereby sentenced to 30 days in the county jail, to be served immediately, completely independent of the outcome of this current trial." The defense attorney gasped audibly, a sound of genuine, unadulterated shock. He scrambled to his feet, his hands fluttering over his legal pads. "Your Honor, please, my client meant no harm. We request a short recess to consult." "Request denied, Counselor." I cut him off, my voice cracking through the room like a whip. "Your client understood exactly what he was doing, and now he will understand exactly what I am doing. Bailiff, take Mr. Thorne into custody." For the first time since he swaggered into the courtroom that morning, Victor Thorne's perfect posture broke. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and sudden, sharp realization. The invisible shield of untouchability he had worn for decades was shattering right in front of him. The bailiff stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic clink sounded unnaturally loud in the dead silence of the courtroom. Thorne instinctively pulled his hands back, a microscopic gesture of resistance, but the bailiff was faster, grabbing his wrists with practiced efficiency. "Hands behind your back," the bailiff ordered, his voice flat and professional. Thorne looked at his attorney, who was standing frozen, utterly powerless to stop the machinery of justice that had just been violently engaged. Then, slowly, Thorne looked back at me. The smirk was gone. The arrogance was gone. In their place was the stark, naked look of a man who realized he was no longer in control. "Take him away," I commanded. As the bailiff marched the notorious crime boss toward the holding cell door, his expensive suit wrinkling awkwardly against the restraint of the handcuffs, I turned my attention back to David Miller. The witness was staring at the retreating figure of his former boss, his chest heaving, tears of absolute relief streaming down his face. The system hadn't failed him. The fear hadn't won. And in that moment, the entire trajectory of the trial and the dismantling of Victor Thorne's empire was irrevocably set in motion. The heavy steel door leading to the holding cells clicked shut, but the metallic echo seemed to linger in the courtroom for minutes. With Victor Thorne physically removed from the space, the entire atmospheric pressure of the room instantly depressurized. It was as if a suffocating blanket had been lifted off the shoulders of everyone present. I looked down at the defense table. Thorne's lead attorney, a man who usually commanded the room with expensive charisma and aggressive objections, was staring blankly at the empty leather chair next to him. His carefully constructed strategy had just been completely incinerated in less than 5 minutes. He had prepared for cross-examinations, for evidentiary disputes, and for closing arguments. He had not prepared for his client to let his ego override his legal survival. "Your Honor," the defense attorney stammered, finally finding his voice, though it lacked any of its usual resonance. "Given the extraordinary circumstances and the removal of my client, the defense moves for an immediate mistrial. The jury will inevitably draw prejudicial conclusions from his absence." I adjusted my glasses and looked down at him, my expression unyielding. "Motion denied. Counselor, a defendant cannot deliberately sabotage the judicial process through active witness intimidation and then use his subsequent rightful punishment as grounds for a mistrial. That is not how the law operates. Your client chose his actions, and now he must navigate the consequences. We are moving forward. In absentia, if necessary." I signaled the bailiff to bring the jury back into the room. This is always a delicate psychological moment in a trial. Legally, I am required to instruct the jury on how to process what they are seeing, but human nature is an entirely different beast. As the 12 jurors filed back into the box, I watched their eyes immediately dart to the defense table. I saw the synchronized moment of collective shock when they realized Thorne was gone. The intimidating, perfectly tailored crime boss who had loomed over the proceedings all morning had simply vanished. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," I addressed them calmly, keeping my tone strictly administrative. "The defendant, Mr. Thorne, has been temporarily removed from the courtroom due to a procedural matter entirely separate from the charges you are here to consider. You are to draw absolutely no inferences, positive or negative, from his absence. Your sole duty is to evaluate the evidence presented." They all nodded, but I've been reading juries long enough to know the truth. The legal instruction was necessary, but the psychological reality was undeniable. By seeing Thorne removed, the jury realized he was not a ghost, not a god, and not above the system. He was just a man who could be put in handcuffs. The aura of invincibility was completely broken. With Thorne sitting in a concrete cell, David Miller's testimony transformed from a trickle of terrified admissions into an absolute avalanche of damning truth. Unburdened by the predatory gaze of his former boss, Miller spent the next 3 hours systematically dismantling Thorne's empire. He mapped out the money laundering routes, identified the shell corporations, and testified to the exact dates and locations of the extortion plots. The defense attorney tried to cross-examine him, trying to punch holes in Miller's credibility, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. It is incredibly difficult to aggressively defend an empty chair, especially when the man who was supposed to be sitting in it had just proven the prosecution's point better than any piece of evidence ever could. The courtroom, once Thorne's stage for intimidation, had officially become the site of his undoing. When the door slammed shut on Victor Thorne, It didn't just lock him away. It shattered the psychological dam that had held back a flood of justice for years. The ripple effect was immediate, tangible, and astonishing to witness. It was as if the entire courtroom collectively exhaled, realizing that the invisible, suffocating rules of the underworld no longer applied. David Miller's testimony, which spanned 2 grueling days, was just the beginning. His detailed account of the warehouse meeting, the extortion rings, and the financial shell games provided the prosecution with the exact roadmap they needed. But more importantly, the news of Thorne's arrest for contempt spread through the city's criminal network with the speed of a wildfire. If the untouchable Victor Thorne could be handcuffed and dragged into a holding cell for simply whispering a threat in a courtroom, the message to his subordinates was clear. The shield is gone. Every man for himself. Within 48 hours of Thorne's courtroom removal, the prosecution's phone lines began to ring. 3 more key associates, individuals who had previously refused to cooperate out of sheer terror, suddenly found their courage. They walked into the district attorney's office, demanding immunity deals in exchange for their testimonies. They had seen the footage on the evening news, the sketches of Thorne being led away, the reports of a judge who refused to back down, and they realized the ship was sinking. The trial resumed with a momentum that Thorne's defense team was completely powerless to stop. Witness after witness took the stand, their fear replaced by a desperate scramble to distance themselves from a fallen kingpin. They corroborated Miller's statements, handed over ledgers, and testified to orders explicitly given by Thorne himself. Through it all, Thorne was brought back into the courtroom, forced to sit silently as his life's work was meticulously dismantled. The arrogance that had defined his entrance on the first day had been replaced by a hardened, bitter silence. He had learned the harsh lesson of my courtroom. True power isn't measured by how many people you can terrify on the street. True power is the immovable, unyielding structure of the law, applied equally and without hesitation. His defense attorney fought valiantly, attempting to frame the avalanche of testimonies as the desperate lies of criminals looking to save their own skins. But the jury wasn't buying it. They had witnessed the intimidation attempt firsthand. They had seen the true face of Victor Thorne, and no amount of legal maneuvering could erase that image from their minds. They weren't just deliberating on the evidence anymore. They were deliberating on the character of the man sitting before them. When the jury finally returned with their verdict, after only 4 hours of deliberation, the courtroom was entirely devoid of its previous electric tension. It had been replaced by a heavy, undeniable sense of finality. Victor Thorne was brought back into the room. He was no longer wearing his immaculate, custom-tailored suit. He wore the standard-issue orange jumpsuit of the county jail. The physical transformation was striking. Without the expensive armor of his wealth and the theatrical backdrop of his intimidation tactics, he looked incredibly small. He was no longer a crime boss. He was just an ordinary man about to face the crushing weight of reality. The foreperson stood up a middle-aged woman who wouldn't have dared to make eye contact with Thorne 3 days ago. Now, she looked right past him, focusing entirely on the bench. On the charges of racketeering, severe extortion, and witness tampering, her voice rang out clear and steady, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. We find the defendant guilty on all counts. Thorne didn't flinch, but his shoulders slumped. The absolute last trace of his untouchable status dissolved completely into the sterile, fluorescent lighting of the courtroom. The empire was gone. I struck the gavel once, a sharp sound that secured the absolute silence of the room before I delivered the sentence. Mr. Thorne, I began, my voice carrying the full, unyielding weight of the justice system. You walked into this courtroom believing that the fundamental rules of society did not apply to you. You believed that fear was a currency that could buy your way out of accountability. You thought your reputation would be an impenetrable shield. I paused, waiting until he was forced to lift his head and meet my gaze. But justice does not care who you are. It does not cower before intimidation, and it certainly does not negotiate with arrogance. You attempted to corrupt the very foundation of this institution, and in doing so, you orchestrated your own absolute downfall. I sentenced him to consecutive maximum terms, ensuring he would spend the rest of his natural life behind the concrete and steel he thought he could outsmart. As the bailiffs escorted him out of the courtroom for the final time, there were no dramatic speeches, no parting threats, and no trace of the powerful kingpin who had swaggered in days earlier. There was only a broken criminal, finally answering to the law. I have presided over hundreds of cases since that day, but the trial of Victor Thorne remains permanently etched in my mind. It stands as a profound reminder of a core truth I have learned over decades on the bench. Power, no matter how vast or deeply entrenched, is entirely fragile when it collides with unwavering integrity. When privilege fails and the facade of intimidation crumbles, true character is the only thing left standing. And in my courtroom, that is the only currency that will ever matter.